Hello and welcome. My name's Lisa Upton. I'm the Communications Director with the Climate Council. This evening, I'm joined from Stockholm by the Swedish filmmaker Nathan Grossman. In Sydney, we're joined by student striker and author Daisy Jeffrey, and in Melbourne, the Climate Council's CEO Amanda Mackenzie. I want to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are joining us. This evening, we're talking about Nathan's new film, I Am Greta. The film follows Greta Thunberg's rise to prominence, from a lone schoolgirl sitting outside the Swedish parliament to a global icon at the centre of the international school strike movement. Nathan, you followed Greta from the beginning, before anybody had any idea that her single act of protest outside the Swedish parliament would generate something so powerful. And you were able to follow Greta on her journey for a year. You must be the envy of documentary makers everywhere. How did it happen?
Yeah, like many documentaries, it actually started with a tip. A friend of me and my boss knew Greta's family a little bit and told us that she was going to do some kind of small manifestation outside the Swedish parliament. And this was before the Swedish election. And I had been doing a little bit of documentaries, not directly on climate change, but like in connection to the topic. So we had a discussion at the office, and I said that I wanted to do like a recce and go down there and give it 1 or 2 days to see if she was of any interest. Maybe just with the notion of feeling that it was interesting with someone young that was going to do something for the climate. But of course, it's always one of those kind of win or lose situations. Many times you go down and you end up with nothing actually, that you stop filming after a few days and feel that this is not a story to continue with. But of course with Greta, it developed very quickly into something very interesting.
Yeah, I was so struck, Nathan, by how intimate this film feels. Greta and her family obviously really trusted you. How did you build that trust?
I think it's actually comes down to time. And I think it's something we tend to forget when it comes to not only filmmaking, but journalism, and in many ways that everything is going so quick nowadays. And we documentarians sometimes are the only ones that actually have the time to spend with a person or with a topic for an extended period. And I think for me, that was definitely the key. Not only in this project, it's always to get access and to be able to tell kind of my point of view of a story. And also with Greta traveling by train and electric car, sometimes for you in Australia, it's good to explain, but Europe is big and Sweden is like on the top corner. So going by train or electric car takes lots and lots of time to go down to Europe. And with me going on some of those journeys, I had time to talk with her and also with her father and explain why I wanted to do this film, and also get to know her beyond kind of the headlines.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what you did, because we see so much of her that we've never seen. We see these moments of joy and laughter. We get to know her dad. We see how much she loves her animals. You've actually done what news and current affairs so often fails to do, which is give us a much more holistic view of Greta as a person. Is that what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's exactly that. And that's always, not only when it comes to Greta, actually anyone who's kind of in the public sphere. I tend to think that sometimes it's so easy that we see those people as one-dimensional beings, because in the news, that's how we need to structure storytelling, because they have so little space in the newspapers and in the morning shows and whatever. But when you spend 1.5 hours in a film and you can kind of dive down into someone's head almost, you start to see so many new kind of dimensions and sides. And with Greta, as you say, it's much sides that we haven't seen, with her being kind of more teenagey and bubbly, but also showing why she has repeated this message over and over again, that she doesn't want this to be the responsibility of her and other children, but that she wants this responsibility to actually be something that is taken by us adults, and that she and many of the fantastic climate strikers who we have one of today here is an alarm bell, which we should be so thankful for, reminding us that we have spent, I don't know, 30, 40 years, especially in Sweden, discussing this matter, and haven't, really come very far. That's a message they can say, but they don't want the question to be shoved onto their shoulders of everything else.
Amanda, can you share some of your reflections of the film?
Yeah, I love the film. I saw in Greta so much of what I've seen in youth climate activists from right around the world over the years. And Greta is so clearly guided by her moral compass when she's navigating this murky world of global politics and media and vested interests. And she's continually able to cut through with that clarity that comes from the authenticity she shows, her passion, her intelligence. And she's not wowed by the high profile people she meets. She knows the emperor's not wearing any clothes. And I think she is clearly so courageous and driven by what she knows is required. And I think that sort of taking on a responsibility and saying, why isn't something being done about this? Like, I as an individual need to do something, is the motivation I've seen in lots of young people around the world. And I remember myself feeling, she says a phrase early on that she was scared that the adults weren't worried. And I remember that early on for me. I sort of switched on to the climate issue in my early 20s, about 15 years ago. And I think I was searching for a long time for, where are the adults that are in charge here, that have some sort of plan to be fixing this? And, going to those United Nations conferences, and I went to Copenhagen, for instance, in 2009 with a big youth contingency, and then the disappointment of not being able to influence decision makers to the extent that we thought was required. And that sort of realization that it wasn't enough just to be putting the information forward, that it's all about power building. And I think Greta seems to have innately sort of appreciated that from the get-go, that you've got to be building power. And she says as well, she had moments of feeling like, do I need to scream? And I remember feeling like that at some of the moments at the UN conferences where we'd meet with decision makers and they'd say, oh, you've just got to wait, these things take time, blah, 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 and say, this is critical, it's an emergency. And some of those conversations we had in Bali in 2007, in Poland in 2008, and obviously having them in the Australian context too. And here we are in 2020, and there has been a lot of progress, but it's not nearly enough.
Daisy, it was great to see you pop up at the end of Nathan's film. Tell us what you thought of it.
I wasn't expecting it to be things I didn't know. I thought it would be a story that I was like, cool, I know this, I'm in the climate movement. I've been doing this for, 2 years now. And it was unexpected as to like how much it really cut through to me and what I was feeling, but obviously amplified because Greta is, has become the focus of this movement, which I know she never wanted to be. And also just to, see the difference between, there's a footage of her walking around at the COP24, eating food, just talking to people, and the difference between that, that year and then the year afterwards, when she had suddenly, it was like everyone was looking at her, and, she couldn't walk through the conference without like a swarm of paparazzi, surrounding her, which was just, you knew where she was going, like you knew whenever she was walking around, because it was just this tiny figure, tiny little feet walking through, and just a swarm of cameras just flashing, and just, thinking about how anxious anyone would be in that position, let alone a kid. And and it also, like, particularly the scene on the boat on the way to New York really struck a chord with me, because it was quite clear that Greta was really burnt out at that stage. And I've, like, there's a thing with like activists, and I think anyone who dedicates their time to something, it's you know, if you don't allow yourself to have a life outside of it, you know, or have like a healthy, you know, existence, if you feel like you have to dedicate all your time and energy to it, particularly if there's a media focus on your dedication to that particular cause, you know, it does result in that burnout and that mental exhaustion. And I mean, I sort of experienced that towards the end of last year, but it really hit me in about March this year. And I had to take a couple of months off and not do anything because I just couldn't, like, I couldn't mentally or physically bring myself to get anything done, you know, and I was just like, I was really depressed. And to see Greta actually in tears experiencing that burnout while she's on the way to be pretty much the central focus at this major climate conference in New York really broke my heart. And just to, it was a real reminder that none of us are built to be, you know, none of us are equipped to be in this position, you know, at any age, let alone, you know, let alone a kid. And you know, particularly to have that, you know, media focus and to have that pressure from the world and to have crowds saying, you'll save us, Greta, I think is, you know, it just, to see her behind the scenes instead of media headlines where it looks like she's just pushing through, she's making it work, she's, you know, making these concise and really powerful speeches, but to see how much hurt that's doing to one human being is, I think, really just demonstrates the failure of our political leaders, you know, to fight for climate justice, you know, to take legislative action. And yeah, I really think the documentary demonstrates that failure by the people in power.
Thanks, Daisy. Nathan, what do you think it is about Greta that has resonated so strongly with people around the world?
Yeah, I still think of it, and maybe a small explanation comes from what Daisy was speaking about now, which maybe I did not really understand until very late in filmmaking, by being in these kind of marches and meeting with lots of activists. Of course, Greta is just like one person, so she can only, like, she's her story and so on. But I think there sadly are lots of kind of similarities between how she feels and many young people, and hearing Daisy speaking about her feelings of kind of campaigning in Australia for a long time, and also becoming very frustrated with not kind of coming to what you want, and becoming very angry, and also in the end also very tired of it. I think it's something that many young people recognize themselves in, and that is of course a very big part of Greta's kind of core, that there, and I must say that I remember very well in the end of the winter of 2018, when the strikes were still, you know, something that was kind of going around a little bit in the Scandinavians, and then suddenly in Australia these strikes started to pop up, and there were tens, 15 thousands of kids in Australia marching. And I remember saying to myself, like, this is crazy. Like, I never thought it would resonate, like that her story would resonate on the completely other side of the world. But I think as you hear with Daisy, and as I've heard with lots of people, they feel that they have a connection to her and a similarity. And then of course upon to that, she has a very clear and structured way of kind of compressing this issue, which is very complicated, to something which is also easy to kind of to understand and relate to. So of course that communication skill kind of adds on to her sheer existence and the connection that many have to her.
Amanda, why do you think she's become the global icon that she has?
So what Nathan says resonates with me too. I think people around the world are desperate for leadership, and they're desperate for this issue to be articulated in a way that's not just about politics and technology, that speaks to the human condition and speaks to the emotion we feel about what we are losing. And I think she's able to channel those emotions and reflect the anger, the desperation, the sense of urgency so well in her communications. And she's also willing to walk the talk. She takes huge responsibility, makes personal sacrifices. Despite her youth, she's just very inspiring. So I think that the movement at that point was needing another ignition moment. I think movements have waves over time, and there's various waves in the last sort of 30 years that have been building. I think about it a bit like a tide coming in, and each wave is sort of bigger than the last. And I think she ignited what was sort of this latent force of people around the world that were looking for the next ignition moment to come out and say what they felt. And particularly young people were waiting for that moment. And then there was this sort of moment to organise around. And then there was a clear sense of direction, like here are some additional events that we can then be organising and reaching out for and all of those sorts of things. So I feel like it was a really unique set of circumstances, and to have a personality that was so compelling at the centre was vital.
Could it have happened if she were in Australia or America? Do you think she would have risen to global prominence, Amanda, here or in the US the way she has in Europe?
I think Europe is probably the ideal place to start, in the sense that there is so many multiple media markets. We saw her meeting with multiple parliamentarians from different parliaments. In Australia, there's like one hostile government to meet with, and the state governments don't have the same sort of global resonance. But for her to meet with Macron and then meet with, the British leadership, etc., was very powerful. And also you've got access to the global media, whereas if she was an African young person or an Asian young person, it might not have had the same carryover into global politics. So I think it was fortunate that she was in Europe, but it did require her being such a brave and passionate leader.
Daisy, how much of an inspiration has she been to the Australian school strikers?
I mean, she was the reason we started. I didn't organise the first strike. I only found out about it about a week before it happened. And so I nagged about like 30, 40 kids from school into coming with me, and, turning the corner to that sort of sweaty mass of teenagers who were, coming together in solidarity to demand change was such an incredible thing. But I don't remember Greta really being the focus of that protest. The focus was climate justice, and that's the way it should be. And I think that's the way Greta would prefer it would be. It's something that's been weird for me, and I understand people wanting to have this focus, but sometimes people, I think, unnecessarily idolize Greta, and I think she's such an incredible human and she's completely noteworthy, but that's not what she set out to do. That's not what she intended. And so what we really should be focusing on is demanding climate justice. And something that I think has been really great about the vast majority of Australian climate protests is that has been completely the central focus. And that's, I mean, in Australia, like getting people out in the street is a really difficult thing because we don't like to do our protests. And so it's been a really incredible thing to see that Greta was sort of the catalyst for this enormous wave of change across the world. And I think her activism has been particularly significant in getting Australians up off their asses out into the streets and, to really, demand a safer future. And that has ultimately grown, that grew into a protest of more than 300,000 Australians across the country, which for us is just enormous. And then to have, tens of thousands of people on the street with about 10 days notice during the bushfires, I think really demonstrated that not only had the climate movement in that past year been really successful at getting people out into the streets, but that people, Australians, and this had really not happened before, were now making that connection between the fires and climate and actually demanding, accountability from our government. And so I think I think youth climate activists owe Greta a lot, because as an individual, and I remember like being in year, I had the privilege of learning about climate change instead of experiencing its repercussions. But I remember learning about it, you know, throughout, you know, a little bit in primary school, but mostly in like year 8 and year 9, but still feeling that as an individual, I didn't really know what I could do to create change. And so I sort of didn't really set out to do anything. And so to have someone like Greta who really saw the cause as it is in black and white and went and decided that she had to make a change and like had to take a stand even if she was on her own. I think youth climate activists around the world, and I owe her a great deal for having that bravery to go out and be the first person, you know, sitting out there and striking for climate. Yeah, so.
Nathan, one of the things that you highlight in the film are the critics, usually very powerful older men, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, the Brazilian leader Bolsonaro, Greta, oh, and of course I shouldn't forget here in Australia, Andrew Bolt, Alan Jones. Greta seems to cope with this remarkably well. Does she cope as well as she appears to?
Of course, I don't know how she copes with every detail, but I was very interested in trying to understand how she kind of looked upon that. But I also think that there is something with many of these, not only like young people, I call it a generation set thing sometimes, where young people seem to be more kind of knowledgeable about social media. They've grown up with it since they were, you know, kids. It's a part of their nerve system in a sense. And they've also then understood that on the internet, there's lots of, sadly, lots of hate and anonymous people and angry people just kind of screaming, and that you don't really need to spend that much time and energy on kind of focusing on that. I think there's a scene in the film, without spoiling it, which kind of explains a little bit how I saw her reacting. But there was also one of few scenes that I captured on that, because she didn't spend that much time kind of rolling around in that hate. And I, of course, understand that, you know, before the movie was even released, when we were in Venice Film Festival, it had only been shown to a few people, you know, in those kind of inner rooms. Already lots and lots of people had tried to kind of click it down on IMDb and attack it. And there must be so much hate about the movie as well. But I haven't read any of that, because why should I kind of spend the time doing it? And I think it's definitely something I learned from Greta in that sense. We need to kind of step above that.
Well, I think Amanda and Daisy have also really experienced their own fair share of criticism. Fortunately, we haven't had Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump attacking them, but they know what it's like to be attacked. They both know what it's like to be dismissed. They both know what it's like for people to treat them in a very patronising kind of way. I'd like to hear from you, Amanda, and then you, Daisy, on how you cope with this, because I'm not sure that everybody does cope with it quite as well as Greta appears to.
Yeah, I think in the movie, that scene where there's been all that feedback and then she's dancing is a really wonderful. So it's really that sort of shake it off sort of mentality, and I think that that is the appropriate way to deal with the hate. Like that, I think there's certain you know, media outlets around the world that if you're rankling them, you're doing exactly the right thing. You know, you're making a difference if certain people are getting really upset with what you're doing. And so you can use that as a bit of a badge of honor. But then there is a point where it's gone further and it can be frightening. Like I've had death threats in the past, etc. And that's where, you know, you can start sort of second guessing yourself and where, is this the right path for me? And like, I've got a small child now, like I know people who've exited the movement as a consequence of worrying about the future of their children. But I think for me, it's always stepping back to say the vast majority of people on our side are on our side now. History is on our side. And I think in the film, Greta broadly articulates it a number of times, just saying, well, I would feel worse if I didn't do this. And for me, it's coming back to that on a whole range of things, like anything that's sort of an obstacle, you just got to say, well, like I'm in the circumstances that I'd rather not be in, but, you know, I've got to keep pushing because that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And Daisy, what about you? How have you dealt with the criticism? Because you've had your fair share of it too.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, yeah, I've sort of had the same mentality as Greta, because I sort of thought these are really like people on the internet who've got nothing better to do. And yeah, there were a couple of pretty extreme threats, which I sort of had to take do a bit of a double take and think, and there was one in particular where I'd been having a conversation, I think, with my dad or my mum, like when I was on the bus, and I got off the bus, and that night I got a text from like this stranger online, like on Instagram, saying that, oh, I heard you talking to, someone on the bus today. And I thought, like, and it was just a bit of a moment where I felt really anxious, and I just felt really anxious getting on public transport after that for a couple of months. And I mean, like, as a white woman, I have not, like, the abuse that I've received online has been misogynistic, but it has never been racialized. And I know a girl who had a death threat sent to her school, and it's, she's Muslim, and it was really racialized hate. And so I'm really lucky in that sense that I don't also deal with that. And so I suppose my strategy is just to shake it off, but also, I'm aware of it and I'll tell people about it, because I feel like it's not something I should just keep to myself. It's something that people should be aware of, that, people, like particularly women, and particularly women of color, are really dealing with this abuse, and it shouldn't be hidden. It should be, these people should be held accountable when and wherever they can.
Yeah, and just to quickly add on to that, I think it's important to note that I don't think that that Greta or kind of diminishes this hate by her reactions. There was even one person who was convicted in Sweden for a threat to her. So I think it's also something that we need to make more the legal system aware of. That of course, if you threaten someone, maybe we should take that threat too much personal, but we should of course file lawsuits, and we should address that through the through the courts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nathan, at one point in the film, Greta talks about having Asperger's, and she says it'd be great if everybody had a little bit of Asperger's when it comes to the climate crisis. Can you explain to us what you think she meant by that?
No, but I think she means that a part of what I think has happened during maybe the last, let's say then 30, 40 years, during all these meetings, and just as Amanda says, lots of things has actually happened, and we have taken steps. So that's good. But what can sometimes happen then is that you become kind of greenwashed in your head, and you start thinking that those kind of incremental steps are actually solving this issue, and then you become blind for the issue where you're so far from it. And I think maybe that's what Greta kind of means with that we need to like sincerely, without all our filters, look at this issue, and then we understand that just by taking, as I said, small incremental steps, of course it matters to some extent, but we need to take much more drastic measures, and both on a systemic level and on an individual level. And I think that's what I at least learned from spending a year with Greta, because I'm a concerned citizen. I'm not connected to any political party or organization, so I'm more of a storyteller about this. But I knew, of course, some. But having kind of putting on her eyes for 1 year, I of course understood that, Jesus, like if someone wants to renovate their kitchen, for instance, what does that mean in carbon emissions, in land use, that we need to have that filter on us everywhere. It's not just about kind of buying, I don't know, organic cotton or paying a small sum to an organization and thinking then it's fixed. It's massive. And I think that's what she sees sometimes with her black and white view of it. And sadly, it's the black and white view is very scientifically correct at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the word that heard her repeat again and again and again was responsibility. And I felt like she's just carrying this really heavy weight because she does understand the science. And Amanda, I feel like you carry that weight too, and you have done from a very young age. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I suppose I do feel a very strong sense of responsibility and I think if you understand what we're facing, you have to take that responsibility on, and people can do that in a variety of ways and to a variety of degrees. But I feel personally that it would be absolutely irresponsible for me living at this moment in time, living in a country that is so wealthy, being educated on the issues, all of that privilege means that I absolutely need to do everything I can to influence the issue in a positive direction. And that's always, as soon as I learned about climate change, that was sort of how I felt. And I think one of the things that Greta says during the film is, we've not taken to the streets for you to take selfies with us and tell you, you admire what we do. I remember as a youth climate activist in particular, and people still sometimes say this to me, like, the future is in good hands because you guys are working on it. And you're like, clearly it's not in good hands. That's the whole point. And I think that what I think Greta articulates really well is putting it on the decision makers and saying, I have taken this responsibility. Now it's your turn. This is what your responsibility is. And she's incredibly blunt in how she delivers that message. And I think what the lesson for the broader climate movement around the world has been that some of the language has been too muted and needs to be, the urgency needs to be rehashed and clarified. I think that it's been so hard to achieve change that when you work on something for a long time, you are thinking about how do you change certain audiences in which particular ways. And I think Greta's great at just cutting through it all and saying, this is the urgency. And, for some, I think that has been a really good circuit breaker in the global conversation.
Daisy, having had numerous conversations too with you over the past 12 months, I think you, Greta and Amanda all share this thing where, and also having spoken to your mum, I know that you carry this very heavily too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've learned, I wasn't dealing with it very well. I wasn't coping very well. I hadn't really developed any effective methods or techniques to help myself cope with that weight. Whereas I see a psychiatrist now because of that, because of that anxiety and to work through that. And unfortunately, a lot of kids don't have that same access. Australia's mental health care system is a whole other story we could talk about. But yeah, the one thing that, I wanted to add to what Nathan said was that I remember Greta saying in the documentary that, she was pointing out how difficult, almost impossible it is to live completely sustainably, and how that's also indicative of a failure, by decision makers to enforce, I suppose, a more sustainable production of, the things that we consume across the world. And, I remember going over to Madrid, I did get a flight, and that was something that I really had to sort of reconcile with myself almost. And I'm still not sure whether I made the right decision going over and taking that flight, because even if you're ticking the box that says, offset your carbon, it's it's still not the most effective thing that you can be doing. And that's more of, the idea of carbon offsets. I mean, it's more of a short-term solution than, mitigating a long-term problem. So I just, look, it's a huge weight. And I know that a lot of kids in the climate movement are really struggling with it. I mean, you'll see kids dropping out of, things like school strike and Fridays for Future all the time. And it is because we don't have the resources to provide that care for everyone, or to, like, we can sort of direct people in the right direction, but you can't really stop people from taking on too much onto their shoulders. And I've been very lucky to recover from it and to be able to reinvest myself in the success of this movement. But there are a lot of kids that haven't been able to, and that's not only due to, you know, just not finding the right person to help them find those techniques to deal with it, but also, like, particularly if they're a rural or regional kid, or they're a person of color, they've often been dealing with more severe repercussions from the climate crisis much longer than any of the rest of us have. And so they carry this extra burden with them on top of their activism. And it is so difficult to continue to invest yourself in this movement. And what we've been demanding this whole time is for decision makers to invest in our future, to invest in us, you know, to invest in this society instead of just following, you know, their own self-interest, their greed. And I'm really, like, particularly in Australia's case, I mean, this government is not really viable, I think, in terms of achieving climate justice. They're a very ideological, self-interested group of people. And I, like, you know, leading up to the next election, I feel like we need to look to others to, you know, to lead us on this, and not necessarily to lead us, but certainly more malleable parties that we can in turn have more of a chance with to fight. And that's just really sad, because we are looking at incremental change here in Australia and, you know, in many places across the world. And the amount of relief that I felt, and I know a lot of others felt, when we were in a meeting at 3:30 in the morning and we found out that Biden had won the election. And, like, the US settled for Biden, but we were so excited that the US was back at the bare minimum in the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think it really, that all of that, you know, all of that collective sort of, like, incremental change, but also 2 steps back and 1 step forward type politics is really scary. And the fact that we were excited about that, I think, speaks to how invested we all are in the movement's success, and how scared we were. And now that we get, you know, we feel relieved by the small things when we actually have such a big change to create. And I do worry about how we are going to be able to do this over the next, you know, 9 and a little bit years now, how we're going to be able to really force wealthy countries in particular to take ambitious action on climate, and then in turn to fight for climate justice.
I'm very conscious, thank you, Daisy, that Nathan, you're incredibly busy and we need to let you go. I'll just throw one quick question to Amanda and then come to you to end, Nathan, if that's okay. Amanda, I just wondered if you would like to reflect on what Daisy was saying about mental health. You've been doing this for a very long time, and I've often wondered how it is that you haven't completely burnt out. Do you want to reflect at all on what Daisy's just said?
Yeah. I think it is one of the challenges is thinking about climate action and outcomes as being, there's been a cliff deadline. Like, obviously the 2030 deadline is important, but there's never going to be a slope into, a cliff in terms of the, like, we don't get to 1.5 degrees and then it's all over. Every 1/10 of a degree after that will matter. So I think the message I have to others working in the movement is we need to see it as a marathon. We are probably working on this our whole lives, and what that means may change over time, but that activism will be with us forever. So we often say this in the Climate Council, as soon as you're involved for life. And I think that finding ways to maintain your own mental health in that is hard. I found it particularly hard when I remember when I first got involved in starting the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. I thought we'll be wrapped up with this issue in 6 months, because obviously once people realise how bad it is, we'll be acting. Well, here I am, 15 years later. I think having buddies that can, you can talk to genuinely that validate your concerns. I find that if you just talk to family and friends, they don't necessarily understand what you know and the scale of the existential threat. So you need to have people that understand that when you say what you mean, when you say I'm scared, and what you're scared of. So I think that validation is important, and feeling like you can have that conversation with people without making them even more scared. So you don't have to take responsibility for them, their emotion, that they can sit with you in your fear and desperation. I think it is important to have a degree of separation. I find in my work, I can find a lot of joy in the intellectual part of my job and all the people I work with. But once I get into, like, we're doing a lot of work at the moment on the detail of the science, and I find that very anxiety provoking. So I've got to manage the sort of balance for me in sort of what I'm working on. And then taking time, like I think what you did, Daisy, recognizing where your mental health is at and taking a couple of months off, that's absolutely what you, like when you need to do it, you need to do it. And we should all support each other in taking that time. Because, you know, no one's a machine in this. We all feel the grief. We're here because we care about people, we care about ecosystems, we care about animals and plants and insects and the whole magnificent world that we live on. And having the capacity to actually go away and say, I feel this and it hurts a lot. But, you know, action to me has been always the best antidote, that you come back and you say, well, there's no other choice. Action is the way that I can keep, you know, doing what I can in this.
Thanks, Amanda. Nathan, thank you again for your time. Just one last question. I know you've been concerned about climate change for a very long time, but did this film change you or alter your perspective in any way?
Yeah, just first to say, because it was very emotional hearing you speak, Daisy, about your experiences, and I just had to kind of remind you maybe and also the audience that you're not alone in that feeling. And I remember I've seen studies here in Sweden. I had to just double check it to give the right figures, but there are different, of kind of maybe around 80% of young Swedes feeling to some regard anxious about the climate. So in that sense, these young people, they're so smart, and hearing you speak, I understand that you're not a person that you can kind of shove this issue under the carpet. You would pick it up anyway, because I hear you're very intelligent and understand the issue, and seeing in those figures that there are so many percent of them, I'm talking about Swedish young people being worried, makes me sad, but it's also something which can sometimes give a little bit of strength, knowing that you're not alone in that worry, that many young people feel as you do. So that I just wanted to point out. And to say about how I have changed over the course of making this film, I think I will have to go back to the lens. Today maybe it's very clear with my glasses here reflecting. So I think about them as my kind of lens seeing the world. And I think it comes to understanding that like asking myself sometimes, okay, but what is this worth? Like what is kind of what is meaningful for me in a sense? And I think I have that focus on me in what I do when I do storytelling. But I also have it when it comes to my individual decisions, in the sense of that maybe the most meaningful thing for me is to have time and just to be with my friends and do things of joy. It's not consuming things. And yes, there are things that I sometimes have to do that has a carbon kind of footprint, and then I take it. But there's also lots of things which is just kind of not something that gives me much joy. Actually, sometimes just takes much of my time, and that is also bad for the environment. Buying new stuff all the time that I then need to take care of. It's kind of very easy then to kind of step out of some of those things. So being kind of mindful, I think that's on an individual level. And then of course, systemic, that we all know is to be engaged. And if you're, whatever you do, you can definitely find something which your talent kind of connects to, and you can do a difference in that.
Nathan, we really appreciate you joining us this evening. I know you're extremely busy, so thank you very much. Thank you to Daisy. Daisy, it's great to see you again. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you to our community of generous regular givers. The Climate Council is an independent community funded organisation, and we couldn't do this without you. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Lisa. Bye.
Bye.